So I think we'll get started. For anyone who does not know, I'm Diane Sayre, and I am a candidate for U.S. Senate in the state of New York, and I'm being joined this evening by Richard Freeman, who's there somewhere. There he is, and we have quite a presentation today. I wanted to I found a phenomenal video, actually a whole webcast from Lyndon LaRouche from August 1st, 2009, which I'm going to show you just a little clip of. For people who are not aware, Mr. LaRouche was a World War II veteran, and I can see another World War II veteran has joined us, Al Corby. Hi, Al, good to see you. And we owe a great debt of gratitude to our World War II veterans on this 75th anniversary of the war. But what I want to get across right from the beginning is that we are at an extraordinary crisis for mankind. It's not just the United States, it's global. And there may be, I think many people are concerned, rightly to some degree, about the United States elections coming up. Obviously, if Biden or anyone remains the Democratic nominee, I mean, the current Democratic Party is completely insane and genocidal. But I have to say that we have to make sure that this administration takes certain emergency actions well before the election. And the success of these actions will determine most probably the outcome of the election. And this question of the anniversary of World War II is extremely important. I would like to remind everybody that in that war, the Soviet Union lost 27 million people. And my husband and I have been watching a series of 40-minute videos about the battles, and what Putin wrote in his paper about World War II, The Truth About World War II, is absolutely correct. The Soviet Union bore the brunt of the Nazi onslaught, and the siege of Leningrad, which went on for 900 days, where 1 out of 3 or maybe more people died of starvation, disease, or being shot. The assault on Stalingrad, these things were unbelievably brutal, and it's really not discussed here. China lost close to 30 million people in this war, but you would think, from the way Pompeo talks about it, or Nancy Pelosi and Hillary Clinton, and I think you might want to reflect why Pompeo, Pelosi, and Hillary Clinton all have the same line, that it was a terrible thing that the Soviets liberated Auschwitz, or that the rape of Nanjing carried out by the Japanese against China, which with hideous war crimes, was just, you know, a walk in the park, or some kind of, you know, some kind of game. This was a hideous, hideous war in which millions and millions of people died. And Franklin Roosevelt's role in that, and his ability to mobilize the United States to be a massively productive economy, was absolutely crucial. Now, LaRouche was stationed in Burma and then in India. I'm just giving you that background so when you hear him speak, you know what he's referring to. Now, fast forward. In the last, maybe even 20 years, LaRouche has did speak over and over again about the necessity for the United States, Russia, China, and India, that is the largest nations, the largest economies, the nations with advanced scientific capability, as you can see by the space programs in particular of these countries, had to come together to establish a new financial, I would say really a new credit system for the world, to go back to fixed exchange rates. And later in this webcast, he says that the one very beautiful way for this to come together would be around a combined Mars mission, a mission to establish a manned colony on Mars, which is a collaborative, coordinated mission, not a competition. So what do we have to do today? Why should these nations meet? Well, we have a global pandemic, which is not just spreading wildly in the United States, it's increasing in Ibero-America, it's increasing in Africa, it's spreading in nations that don't have running water, don't have electricity, don't have hospital systems, and it's changing in the United States. People may have heard that it does not seem to be true that children do not transmit the disease or rarely transmit the disease. In Florida, one area of testing, 1 out of 3 children tested positive for COVID-19. I just heard a report tonight of one of our supporters who has been infected with COVID-19. He got it from his wife. How did she get it? She works in a daycare center, and a child at the daycare center was sick. So think about the implications of opening the schools right now. We are not prepared to do that. In the Q&A or later, if Rich wants to tell you something about South Korea, they have handled this very successfully. They are opening the schools, but the students are all surrounded by, on 3 out of 4 sides, by plastic barriers. There are very strict standards. You'd have to do quite an investment to make that possible, and we should do that. Frankly, producing all of this material would be part of a physical economic recovery of the United States. Now, it happens that President Putin of Russia actually has proposed something very similar to what Mr. LaRouche called for. He said, why don't the permanent members of the UN Security Council, which are the US, Russia, China, the UK, and France, get together and have a summit so we can take up these questions, these emergency security concerns, the COVID crisis, the economy, etc. And Mrs. LaRouche said, this is exactly right. We should absolutely do this. It doesn't include India, it includes Britain, which we might prefer they wouldn't be there, but Boris Johnson has actually just now called for an FDR New Deal. So that's kind of interesting if the world's going to do that. Now, what's the problem in the US? Every time President Trump is about to meet with these leaders, there is some crazy new Russiagate crazy story, like the absurd story that people may have heard that the Russians were supposedly paying bounties to the Taliban to kill American soldiers. Now, the Taliban have been killing American soldiers. It's obviously absurd. And the Russians said they figured the New York Times, which broke this story, which is really fake news, doesn't like the fact that Afghanistan is one of the main areas of cooperation between the US and Russia. President Trump has said repeatedly he wants to get our troops out of there. He doesn't want us engaged in perpetual regime change wars. He's attacked the military-industrial complex. So Putin puts a proposal on the table. Pompeo, our Secretary of State, and Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, have been discussing it. And the next thing you know, we have another story. Russia is trying to steal the scientific secrets of developing a vaccine. Now, first of all, the whole world is racing to develop a vaccine. China already said if they figure out a vaccine that works, they're not going to hoard the information. They're going to make it available to the world. So what if they are? I mean, it's just completely ridiculous. Do you care about human life, or is everything designed over survival of the fittest, the kind of hideous Lord of the Flies mentality. And I would say that this coup against Trump and the way that it's shaped, that is the Russiagate story, and then on the other hand, all of this campaign against the Chinese Communist Party that we hear from Pompeo and Hillary and Pelosi. And unfortunately, Trump has been echoing it because some idiots in the Republican Party have told him that that's the way to get reelected, even though he had formerly had a very good relationship with Xi Jinping, even though he had previously correctly praised the Chinese response to the virus. So you have a that is the coup. Now, what else is the coup? The other part of the coup is this so-called Black Lives Matter situation. And as everyone knows, this thing has become a front for a what has been called the counter-gang operation, where you create operations in both sides. For example, in Charlottesville, if you remember what happened there, you have some real white supremacist racists come in and they claim that they're Trump supporters. And then on the African American side, you have some raving, violent communists or claim to be communists, and you create a fake division between these two sides, and you get it as violent as possible because the point is to make the United States ungovernable and perhaps to create a security situation where something unspeakable could happen to the president, and you say, oh, well, it's just part of this operation. The other aspect of this, which is very clear, is the removal of statues. They've already done quite a number on American history in our country by telling children that all of the founding fathers were a bunch of slave-holding racists, when actually the whole point of creating our nation was to liberate the world from the European oligarchical system. And in fact, many of our founding fathers, emphatically the most important ones, were vehemently opposed to slavery, like Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, Gouverneur Morris, John Jay, who organized against slavery. So they understood that we could not say that we were a republic to elevate mankind, to elevate freedom, and have this kind of system. And that, you know, we can discuss more of later. This myth about Christopher Columbus just being some kind of, I don't know what, person coming over to loot and pillage and enslave people. It's just not true. He was an extraordinary scientist who took an enormous risk traveling across the ocean to come to the New World. And his own crew was so superstitious that he had to keep two sets of books, one so he knew navigationally where he was going, and another one that he showed the crew pretending that they were going somewhere else so they weren't terrified and didn't all, you know, mutiny or something. But people don't know this. I will also just say that what de Blasio is doing in New York is really hideous. This stunt of having Black Lives Matter painted on the street in front of Trump Towers, and then forcing 26 members of the NYPD, whom de Blasio is about to cut $1 billion out of their, or he's cutting $1 billion or $1.5 billion out of their $6 billion budget, making them guard it, and then having people come in who are supposedly African American Trump supporters and try and cover it with black paint. And then a police officer who is trying to protect this thing slips and cracks his head open and has to go to the hospital. This is really sick. And de Blasio, besides smoking a lot of pot, which I think he probably does, was in Germany in 2017, where he addressed an anti-Trump demonstration of raving environmentalists. And this group during the couple of days that he was there, actually attacked and injured 500 police officers. So this is what you're talking about with the mayor of New York. This is not to say that there are not issues with racism or police brutality. You may have seen Senator Tim Scott. He's an African-American Republican senator, and he said, I've been stopped by the police 7 times this year already for driving while black. You know, your signal, you didn't signal soon enough when you made that right turn, something like that. He and President Trump, after the George Floyd murder, or President Trump had a meeting with police officers, because you'd think that would be a group that you'd want to discuss this with, and that they might have ideas, since most police are not crazy, and they have probably been anguished to see some of their colleagues get out of control. So how do you deal with this? They came up with a bill which the Democrats mobilized to defeat. But think about what the police are being confronted with. We have a society, and think about today, we've been in lockdown for 4+ months. The new stimulus has not yet been passed. People who've been getting unemployment and the $600 bonus, for all we know, or they know, it could be running out on July 25th. People, 30% of Americans were unable to pay their rent or their mortgage last month. There is enormous tension and anxiety. There's a massive spike of drug overdoses. So people in law enforcement who are trained in law enforcement are being deployed into situations where what you really need is a psychotherapist or a social worker or someone who's skilled at dealing with people in crisis, who has gone to school and had a lot of training in that. It's a really unfair and difficult situation. Therefore, what we actually need is we need a mission. The nation needs a mission. The first step is this meeting of the heads of state. What Putin has proposed is a phenomenal proposal. We should crush the coup and get Trump freed up to go there. And I'll just say, and we'll be talking about it more at the end, but William Binney, the NSA whistleblower, former technical director of the NSA, who did the forensics on the Guccifer 2 leak and proved that it was not a Russian hack, but a data removal from a internal storage device, is going to be giving an international press conference on Thursday morning, sponsored by the Schiller Institute, that will be live streamed and people can broadcast it. We want to get that out far and wide. It's very important. That's part of breaking the coup. In the United States and globally, what this group needs to discuss is an international plan for dealing with COVID, to create a public health platform, that we don't just sit back with our hands tied and say, oh yes, we'll let all those poor people in Timbuktu without running water handle it on their own. No, we can't do that. Or we say, well, we're sorry that COVID is disrupting food supply, and we're prepared to countenance 300,000 people dying per day of starvation. Can you imagine that? An entire city dying per day of starvation because of the locust plagues, because of other things going on. This is not acceptable, and Americans don't want this. Our nation was created for the good, to defeat the British imperial model. And then finally, LaRouche PAC put out a platform for 1.5 billion productive jobs worldwide. 50 million or 60 million of them would be in the United States as a spear point for this. So that's really what I wanted to say by way of introduction. I am optimistic. I think the American people are basically good. I don't think the American people are as divided as the fake news wants everyone to think. I think people are being bombarded by every imaginable operation. And those of us here tonight have an enormous amount of organizing work to do. So to close, I'm just going to have you watch Mr. LaRouche, who gives an incredible history lesson on the period from his involvement in World War II up through the 1970s. And I think it may be a little different than what you've heard before or how it's been presented to you, but I think you should consider the truth of it and reflect on how we got to be where we are. And then after that, we'll turn it over to Rich Freeman.
We all shared implicitly, at least most of us shared, those who were engaged in war, the outlook of Franklin Roosevelt. We wanted a world cast in the image of the American Revolution. We wanted a world of freeing people from colonialism. We wanted a world of buildup of nation states and economies to eliminate the kind of desperation and depredation that we saw in Asia. What conditions we saw in Asia were for us almost unbelievable as Americans coming from inside the United States. We couldn't believe that this was acceptable. We were disgusted by it. We had great power. Let's get rid of it. Let's get rid of the British Empire. But Truman, what did he do? We had worked as people who were working in connection with where I was in Michigan, working with Ho Chi Minh. We had freed Indochina from the Japanese occupation and from French occupation. We had put the Japanese troops into prison camps, disarmed. What happened with Truman? Ho Chi Minh had led the freedom of Indochina with the cooperation of the United States against the British and against the Japanese occupation. Under Truman, reversed everything of that sort in Roosevelt's policies immediately. Went back to imperialism. We caused the liberation by the British of the Japanese soldiers from their prison camps in Indochina. The British gave them back their weapons and told them to reoccupy the country. With the result, of course, we had this little war in Indochina that we were stuck in during the 1960s and early 1970s. Against whom? Against our ally of the Roosevelt period, Ho Chi Minh, for the sake of the British. What happened then? There had been a liberation in the former Dutch East Indies, liberation from the Japanese. The British and the Dutch conducted a war of support against Indonesia. And throughout the entire world, wherever we in the United States had been dedicated to the freedom of former colonial victims, we, under Truman, went British against the policy which had made us the great power on this planet. What did we do to ourselves? We had intended to take this great power, this great economic power, which we had created and developed under anticipation of war and wartime conditions. We destroyed it. We shut it down. Instead of using our military factories and so forth and converting them back for civilian production and for the development of the economies of the world with the technology which these formerly oppressed people required, we shut it down. We put ourselves into an unnecessary recession. And we became a running dog of the British Empire. That changed somewhat under Dwight Eisenhower. But under Truman, we were betrayed. We went through police state conditions to try to get the Roosevelt out of us. That's what happened. Under Eisenhower, we were disgusted with Truman. Truman was told to quit. You bum, we don't like you. Get the hell out of here. And we got in Eisenhower. Well, Eisenhower would have been a good president in 1947, but after all these conditions, he inherited a government to which he was elected, which included people who were still of this British bent. We had Kennedy. I don't know how good Jack Kennedy was or how bad he was. I know that what he did as president in a number of cases was crucially important for the United States, and he did attempt to restore our economic policy to what it had been under Roosevelt. He ran on that ticket with the support of Eleanor Roosevelt, heavy support from her. And he was praised. And then when he resisted not only the Wall Street gang, which wanted to kill him, but when he resisted the British demand that we go to a war in Indochina, Kennedy had consulted at length with former General Douglas MacArthur, who was still an acting general, although in retirement. And MacArthur advised him, and Kennedy agreed. The United States will not engage in a land war in Asia. That was the policy. That was Kennedy's policy. Well, a very simple thing, kill him, and they did. Not Oswald. It was 3 guys crossing the border with rifles who were expert assassins. They killed him, got away from the knoll, the grassy knoll, went back across the border into Mexico, and resumed their role in the same operation which had been deployed in many attempts to assassinate Charles de Gaulle in France. This was the anti-Gaullist fascist movement. At that point, the minute the president was dead, President Johnson came in. Johnson, as said later, was terrified. He thought that the same 3 rifles which had taken down John Kennedy were about to take him down if he resisted, as Kennedy had, the idea of plunging the United States into war in Indochina and similar kinds of wars. Since that time, because Johnson's fear that he would be assassinated if he didn't go along with these guys, we have gone consistently down, 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 down. And since the middle of the 1960s, approximately, but most conspicuously since 1968, since the decision made by Johnson as of March 1st, 1960, the U.S. system, as defined by Roosevelt, was shot down. And since about 1966, there has been a consistent collapse per capita and per square kilometer of the physical economy of the United States and of the mean condition of welfare of the typical citizen of the United States.
So that's quite a stark picture. Remember, that was during the Obama years, but what he said about the economic collapse is true, and we are still in that since we have been doing mostly nothing but printing a lot of money, which has sucked the blood of the physical economy and created hyperinflation. But my colleague here, Richard Freeman, is the expert in these areas, and I asked him to talk to us tonight about what FDR actually did to give you a sense of what LaRouche is talking about and what that has to do with where we are today. So go ahead.
Thanks, Diane. I also want to just say I'm very honored to be here, and I think if people act with the Sayer for Senate campaign as a force in New York, but it's New Jersey, but it's a force for the entire East Coast and for the nation. That's going to be one of the most powerful ways we can start to bring the ideas in that are necessary. So this is it's a good meeting to be at. I would say that what we're looking at, and Diane talked about this, we're looking at an AIDS pandemic. We have a situation in Africa where people are starving and they're simultaneously being killed by AIDS. It's true in Ibero-America, it's true in Asia. And what Helga LaRouche has proposed is that we take that out. And we have to take that out by bringing in immediately a health system. And we have to restore our own health system in this country and in the Western world. And by bringing in the power supplies, the water supplies, the factories that Africa is going to need to survive. You can't have a modern hospital if you don't have electricity to store blood plasma, to have operating rooms that function, to be able to operate CT machines or MRI machines and so forth and so on. So it has to be a total transformation of the whole world. And the United States is going to play a critical role in what Diane mentioned, this 1.5 billion jobs, because we're going to turn our economy into an economy that has 50% productive jobs, altering nature, manufacturing, construction, the agriculture, transportation. Those are the sorts of things that we absolutely have to return to. We can do that. And we can open what has been reported by the Commerce Department of the United States, that there are somewhere between 25 and 30,000 manufacturing plants that have closed just since 2002, so in the last 18 years. And many of them have very important productive capacity, including in New York. Look at places like Schenectady and elsewhere, Rochester, so forth. To do this, we have a labor force that is not being used. There's at least 30 million people, 31 million, collecting unemployment insurance. So whatever figures the government puts out about how many are unemployed, we know there has to be 31 million who are unemployed. And it's actually closer to almost 40 million when you count other categories. So we need an emergency mobilization and the deployment of the full resources of our physical economy by reconverting these closed plants to produce tractors, machine tools, nuclear power plants, things that we're very good at, or if we've forgotten, we can learn very quickly. And we have to deploy a labor force which is dusted off, re-educated, and put to work on doing something which can be of value to the world. And in the process, and this is what's key but often missed, if we undertake that project, we will also undertake the transformation of the United States. We will go from about 11 million manufacturing jobs to 34 million manufacturing jobs. That's quite a leap in the period of 20 years. Now, can we do that? Well, we had some examples in Roosevelt of how such a mobilization is done. And so I want to identify them just by touching on them, not going into depth. I know there are questions people have about Roosevelt. Wasn't he this? Wasn't he that? There's a tremendous misinformation simply because he took on the policy of building the world and the United States in very much the same fashion that Lyndon LaRouche has proposed. And when you do that, you're going to have a tremendous slander operation against you. And that's what happened. I will just say that his great-great-grandfather, who he studied quite a bit, Isaac Roosevelt, was key in passing the Constitutional Convention in New York State. We were the 10th state to pass it. It was a critical state. As an ally of Alexander Hamilton, he helped finance the American Revolution. Those are things we can talk about. What I'd like to talk about here, Diane and I discussed this, is a little bit about what the Tennessee Valley Authority did. So if we could just take graphic number 4, Dave, just to show people what the Tennessee Valley encompasses, just for a moment. I think that will be the right graphic. Maybe the one after that? It's a picture of the map. Yes. Now, this may be a little bit hard to see. We're going to come back to this in a second. It didn't carry as well as we would have hoped. But the Tennessee River is marked darkly, and you can see it rises in the hills of Virginia and North Carolina, which is marked as NC on your map, flows downward, passes a little bit through its tributaries into Georgia, goes into Alabama, which is extremely important in our story, Mississippi, then it flows north up into Paducah, Kentucky, and joins with the mighty Ohio system. Now, let's look at what Roosevelt faced when he signed on March 23rd, 1933, the Tennessee Valley Authority Act, he was only in office all of 2 months. What you had was a collapse of the United States economy. Unemployment was officially a quarter, but for example, in Detroit, if you take people working 10 hours or less per week, and those who were not employed at all, you have more than 50%. So the figures understated what was going on. You had every bank in the United States and the stock exchange and every other feature of the financial system closed when he took office on March 4th, 1934. Back then, you took office in March rather than January. And you had steel production at 24% of so forth. Roosevelt put the system through bankruptcy reorganization. We can discuss that. He then started creating programs. He took an institution called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which had been used originally to bail out banks, turned it on its head into a Hamiltonian institution. And under the New Deal, this spent almost $9 billion. And under the war mobilization, another almost $31 billion. So you had, 24 billion. So $33 billion was spent through a Hamiltonian institution in which credit was issued. That, to put it in today's dollars, we're talking several trillions of dollars. You remember, that's just 1933 dollars. Let's therefore look at what he did as one of the samples of what we can do in principle, and in fact, we can do something very similar in some of the regions that needs this. In this area of the South, let me just state for you a couple of things which you may not know. Tennessee was completely backward. In fact, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Tennessee had never really recovered from the Confederacy. And when the Ku Klux Klan was unleashed in the 1870s and 80s, it really did not develop into the 20th century. Let me give you an example. In 1925, the infection rate for malaria in Tennessee was between 30 and 40%. Adult illiteracy was up to 50%. There was smallpox. There was typhoid. In the region, only 3% of Tennessee farmers, only 1% of Mississippi farmers had electricity. So they were just functioning it was like walking in Europe into a feudal society in the 14 or 1500s. It had just been entirely neglected. Remember, Lincoln and Thaddeus Stevens wanted to reconstruct that. That never happened. So what did he do? Well, he said, the problem here is the rivers overflow. That area, this whole valley, which you saw, that whole area was a valley around the Tennessee River, has 4.5 million acres of fertile soil, but only 1.5 million could be used because the topsoil would run off. There were floods. All the tributary rivers that we were looking at, the Holston, Hiwassee, the Little Tennessee, the French Broad, they could not be navigated. You had no power. So Roosevelt said, let's take this from the top down. Let's create an authority, it's called the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was part of the government, but it would work with private initiative. And we're going to change the entire contour of this. And this is a concept that you may have heard when you're hearing classes from LaRouche called potential relative population density. You take an area that has a potential that is thrust so low that it cannot support human life at levels needed for creative development of the workforce. And in the period of 10 to 12 years, you leapfrog it ahead. It's the same area, but you've changed the potential to support population at an increasing level of economic and energy flux density existence. So we're going to see an example of that. So if you've wondered what we mean by that when we use it, let's look at this example. So what was done was 20 dams were built. And if we could have that same graphic that you showed before. Okay, these marks are kind of hard to see, unfortunately. But if you look in Alabama, you may be able to make out, you may not, the Wilson Dam, which is really on the very bottom. It says Wilson and then it says TVA. And if you look to your left, it says Mississippi. Now that was Muscle Shoals. And that was developed during World War I. And it was actually developed as a functioning dam. It was decommissioned. There were people who wanted to keep that alive as a functioning dam under U.S. government operation. And George Norris, who did not live in this area, he lived in Nebraska, and that's the way people thought. He was a senator, he was a Republican, but he was an avid supporter of Franklin Roosevelt and initiated many of the projects. He's the one who came up with the Tennessee Valley Authority. He said, I'm in Nebraska, not a drop of the Mississippi Tennessee River touches me. But as a person who thinks nationally and internationally, I'm going to sponsor the development of that region. I'm going to take it out of that area where 30 to 40% of the population has malaria and so forth. So they took that dam as a start. And if you see those little, what looks like triangles, not triangles, rectangles, there's 20 of them. You probably can't make them out as well. But those became dams. Let me show you two of them that were built. If we go back to number 2 now. Yeah. Now, this is a dam that's under construction. I just wanted to show you that, how they look. This is the Watts Bar Dam, which is under construction. People who were unemployed put to work doing this. Each project had 5,000 to 10,000 workers, depending on how large it was and so forth. If we can go to the next one. Okay, now this is a completed one. This is the Chickamauga Hydroelectric Dam and Reservoir. And what they did is they first of all produced a tremendous amount of electricity that's needed. If you want a modern economy, you have electricity. If you want to go back to foot pedal machines or machines that run by water wheels, that's fine. But if you want to actually develop, you need electricity. So they took these ravaging rivers, dammed them up on one side. If you look to the right of the picture, that becomes a reservoir. And by the way, they're very beautiful camping sites. But on the other side, you let these do their natural drop. And as they drop, you take the water to turn generators, and the generators will turn wheels. And they activate generators, which they're part of that process, and it produces electricity. You also avoid flooding. Now, let's look at next one, please. This is just some of the workers building a dam. And let me give you one example. There's a dam that's very, very high. It's the highest in east of the Mississippi. It's called the Fontana Dam. It's in North Carolina. They built this dam in 18 months. If you want to do something and you're determined to do it, and you have a president who mobilizes on a mission and doesn't just say, oh, I can't do this because these people are against me, or no, you just say, I'm going to go to the American people and we're going to make a decision jointly to do this. They did 3 shifts a day. Anyone who's worked with concrete knows concrete needs time to dry. You do not want to just build a dam in which walls start to crack after 3 days. So what they did is they put in cooling systems. They didn't have steel because that was being used for the war. They literally had to use wood scaffolding. They drilled holes so they could take water that could go through the dam to cool it. And they did this continuously. They worked at night with floodlights and took the most advanced earth moving machine. And they took a dam, which usually takes anywhere from 3 to 5 years, and they built it in 18 months. Now, let me just put a footnote. If you ever noticed where the aluminum plants were built in the United States, they were built in the Tennessee Valley, and they were built up in Washington State, where similar things like the Bonneville Dam and so forth were built. And they built aluminum, which needs a tremendous amount of electricity. So this factored into World War II, and that's another phase of this whole story. The next picture I'd like to just show you is Roosevelt signing this. Next graphic, if we could. That's Roosevelt seated. The gentleman with looks like a bow tie and the sort of very pronounced eyebrows and the white hair standing to Roosevelt's left is George Norris from the state of Nebraska, not a Southerner, but an American. And then the next person I just want to show you is David Lillianthal, and he was the person who actually was the co-director and chairman of the Tennessee Valley Authority from 1933 through 46. He's written a wonderful book, which Diane can tell you about, called Democracy on the March, which you can get from used booksellers for $5, which gives a lot of the story, or at least a good part of some of the story, which is very important. But the other thing people don't know about him is he then became head when he retired as chairman of the TVA. He went over to become the head of the Atomic Energy Commission. So he wanted water power and he wanted nuclear energy. Now, what they did, and I just want to give you just a flavor of the transformation of Tennessee. In 1933, Tennessee had 60% of the electricity per capita that existed in America. They were 40% below where the American average was. By 1944, they had 125%. They had leapfrogged over all the other states, or the average of the states of the United States. It can be done. They were taught how to do contour farming. Contour farming means you build, if you've ever seen a contour map of, say, height, of elevation, and you see these circles telling you how much feet, how high you are, well, you build contours on mountains so that water doesn't run away and erode the topsoil. They built phosphate plants. Tennessee became the Tennessee Valley, all those states, became leader producing of phosphate. They set up 15,000 farms, which were model farms to show people how to use the most scientific methods to operate your farm. They had a health system, which went into the mountains and brought the medical supplies, which were necessary for population solving smallpox and typhoid, unheard things in the 1930s, but actually true. They've set up libraries. They even had mules take books to people in the mountains who couldn't be reached because they thought education was so important. As a result of this, during the period I talked to you about, there was one manufacturing worker for every 2 agricultural workers. By the late 1950s, there was 3 manufacturing workers for every 2 agricultural workers. They had changed the composition. They had aluminum plants. They built aircraft in the area, meaning that once you start to industrialize, you can bring in the entire perspective. And some of the objections of people to the TVA, the last thing I want to say about it, was, well, if we do this here, that will undermine our industry in Ohio, or New York could suffer. And you've heard the same argument about, well, if we develop the developing world, won't we lose markets? As these places developed, they ordered cars, washing machines, which they could actually run because they had electricity to run it. They developed a taste for more advanced life, and the sales from all the contiguous states and states as far away as New York and states as far away as Texas rose because you were developing a place to steadily develop their human potential, and at the same time their economic potential, and at the same time their buying power for goods all around. Now, this became an emblem to the world. People from almost every country sent teams to the United States, to the Tennessee Valley. In fact, He Shi, who was the ambassador from China to the United States, beginning in 1939, he would go to the house of David Lillianthal, I showed you the picture of before, the co-director and then the chairman, and worked out plans for China. And in 1943 or 44, I forget which year, a team of 26 engineers came over. They laid out on the tables everywhere, all the studies they had been getting from the Tennessee Valley Authority. And if you've ever seen the biggest project in the world, which is called for water, Three Gorges Dam, that was conceived in the Tennessee Valley Authority. And there are many other examples of that. Now, just to show you very quickly what else Roosevelt was doing, you have to know that you can mobilize a labor force. People who say, oh no, you have to have a big bureaucracy and it takes years. Let me give you one example. There were many unemployed, as people know from this story. A person named Harry Hopkins, who became very important for Roosevelt's foreign policy in the 40s, was the head of something called the Civil Works Administration. And he knew there was going to be a very severe winter, 33, 34. So he told Roosevelt, we just don't want to have relief. We want to put people to work. And he convinced Roosevelt that that's what they were going to do. So on November 9th, 1933, the Civil Works Administration was born. And Hopkins went to the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, took a folding table It started drafting the work orders that he was going to do. No big bureaucracy, nothing of that sort. So this is November 9th. 2 weeks later, he had 800,000 people employed in the Civil Works Administration. 2 weeks after that, 2 million people employed. 9 weeks after that started, on January 18th, 1934, the CWA, or Civil Works Administration, had 4,263,644 men and women working. 9 weeks. That's less than 3 months. So that's what you can do. Let me just show you quickly then, therefore, a few of the things that were actually built. These are from, there was the Civil Works Administration, which became the Works Progress Administration, which did medium to small level of infrastructure. And then there was a Public Works Administration under Harold Ickes, which did very big projects, like the Triborough Bridge, for example, and the Hudson Tunnel. But if we can go to the next ones, I just want to just show you very briefly. So we built the Hoover Dam. It had been started as the Boulder Dam. So this, of course, as people may know, is out in the area around Arizona and Colorado, and supplied the water for the Imperial Valley, which is the greatest vegetable growing region in the United States and one of the biggest in the world. So we took another part of the country and did this principle. Next one, please. Okay, this is the Grand Coulee Dam. Now that's a map of Oregon and California and Washington State. And the Grand Coulee and the Bonneville Dam, they also have tremendous river flows, and they were having overruns and so forth. So we built the dam. So now we're talking northwest. Before we were talking southwest, Hoover Dam. Before that, we were talking southeast. Okay, next, please. Now, these are some of the projects, and I just want to say, these were allotments. This is from the Public Works Administration for electric power projects. And this is over 60 major electric power projects that Roosevelt built. Next, please. These were programs for hospitals. We're talking we have to build hospitals in the United States. We have to build 17,000 hospitals in the United States, and we have to add beds to deal with health so that we don't get caught by surprise by pandemics, which we should know that unless you raise the potential relative population density of the United States and of the world, will become rather regular features like Ebola, like MERS, like H1N1 flu virus, and so forth. We added, just between 1934 and 1942, 122,000 beds. It can be done. Next, please. Okay, these are water projects. This looks like the United States has chickenpox. You can barely, I mean, these were major water projects that were built for clean water and so forth. And these were built by some of the projects like the Public Works Administration and the Civil Works Administration and so forth. These were real projects. You may hear Roosevelt just built things where people dug a hole and filled them in. Well, I will tell you, having clean water is not doing that. Next, please. Okay, so I just wanted to show you that as an encapsulation of some things that can be done. We can drop this one for a moment. Thank you. And there's much, much more. I just touched on a few things, but think about what we're saying today. People say, well, how could you employ people? Could you mobilize? If we can get the United States to seriously take this COVID crisis, but then use that as the basis for opening up 30,000 plants and employing 33 million people, 34 million, 63 million. I said this wrong before. 63 million people in productive jobs. So we rounded off to 60 million. 63 million. Do you know what we could have accomplished doing this across the economy with the advanced science of fusion, if we develop it, of the space stuff that we're going to learn from Artemis, of building high-speed rail? Do you know what we can turn the United States into? Which is what most people would like to see. But you have to have the will to do that. And you have to have a Rooseveltian, Hamiltonian LaRouche approach. Now, lastly, this is going to be very quick. We can raise questions on the question and answer. Roosevelt took this everywhere in the world. He knew by 1937, 38 that this method worked, which was the American system. Remember what I said about his great-great-grandfather, Isaac Roosevelt, who was called Isaac the Patriot in the family. And if you ever go to Hyde Park and you walk to where the living quarters are downstairs, where the dining room was and so forth, there's this huge portrait painted of him by Gilbert Stuart, who painted the portrait of George Washington that hangs in the National Gallery. He was of that character. And Roosevelt saw him every morning for breakfast. So he thought about him. He actually did some investigative work because he really admired him. And during his campaign in 1936, he addressed the crowd and he said, he was in Poughkeepsie. And he said, "Do you see over there? Well, there used to be a stone courthouse. And in that stone courthouse, my great-great-grandfather, Isaac, helped pass the United States Constitution. And I am part of the American Constitution, both by thought, but by family development." Which most people wouldn't say anything of the sort like that campaigning today, but this was very real to him. This was his identity. You'll hear he's a liberal, he was a communist, he was a consumerist. Forget all that stuff. It doesn't work. Now, let me just show you very quickly. So he sent a mission to Brazil. So if we can get the picture of Roosevelt and the president of Brazil, it's at the end of the group, David. Next. Okay, this is 36. This is President Roosevelt in Brazil. He's with Getulio Vargas, who is the president of Brazil at that time. This is the first time an American president had been in Brazil. Brazil was very underdeveloped. Think of the Tennessee Valley. But Roosevelt sent a mission. Now, if we can go backwards up to the one you had there before, under this fellow named Morris Llewellyn Cook, who, by the way, headed the rural electrification program, which strung power lines to all different parts of the United States that didn't have electricity. And he was a friend from Roosevelt because Roosevelt wanted to develop the St. Lawrence Seaway when he was governor. So they met in 1931-32 when the second term of Roosevelt as governor. So they set a American-Brazil technical mission. Quickly, the next one, please. So this is the Paulo Alfonso hydroelectric power complex built on the TVA principle. The Brazilians knew about it, and we sent engineers who knew it. And they took water, and this is in the São Francisco Valley, which is a river that runs along the coast of Brazil from north to south, as rivers do run when they're below the equator, and it's near the Atlantic Ocean. And this is one of 23 complexes that harnessed hydropower. Next, please. This was another great plan. Brazil had rivers which were not connected, they were connected, but they were not navigable. And just as Roosevelt made the rivers of the Tennessee Valley navigable, he did this team under Morris Llewellyn Cook and the counterpart under Lins de Barro, who was the Brazilian head of economic coordination. And they linked the Negro, you can see that, and the Orinoco. Orinoco is up near Venezuela, and the Negro, so they could take shallow draft boats. And then they linked it into the mighty Amazon, which was a project that had been thought about for hundreds of years. The Brazilians brought it to the United States. They had been thinking about it, but they needed a partner. And the partner was, guess what? The United States, because we thought in these terms. Next, please. Now, this is a place, it's called the Volta Redondo Steel Complex. It's near Sao Paulo, it's actually closer to Rio de Janeiro, but it's near Sao Paulo as well, which is the industrial belt. This was a 1 billion-ton plant. Brazil had 200,000 tons, mostly light steel production. This was bigger than most plants in the world. And the United States sent engineers down there to conceive of how they were going to build it. And when Brazil said, well, we don't have the money, Roosevelt instructed the same Reconstruction Finance Corporation that was building the Tennessee Valley and building all those other things. We lent 2/3 of the money that they needed to build this. So, okay, we're going to build it. And just one sentence from a wonderful speech by the head of Brazil, who I showed you the picture of, Vargas. He said when he was dedicating the plant, when it was being built in 1943, this is what he thought, and this is what he thought of America. This is how America was viewed in the world. He said, in the presence of an undertaking of the magnitude of the ones we are carrying out here, I cannot conceal my patriotic enthusiasm and my confidence in the capacity of Brazilians. The meaning of this picture to us is that our eyes behold the final milestone in the economic emancipation of our country. That's what Roosevelt did. And then he spread it all over the world. India, many, many places, all of Ibero-America, and so forth. What I would like to end with is just to say, not only that this approach is a method. Yes, you can figure out how to build a steel plant and machine tools and so on. If we take what Helga LaRouche said and we run it through a summit of the leading nations of the world, and they're really committed to development, and we make them really committed to this conception, not have a meaningless chatterbox meeting, and they will be taken up by a summit that Putin wants, things like arms control and so forth, which are not meaningless things. We can change the whole world. And once you get this dynamic going, and once we develop Africa and Ibero-America and Asia, and once we get France and Germany and Japan, as well as India and China and the United States and Russia, but with the United States and China being the key pivot, this becomes a self-feeding process for the development of the world. And one of the things that I know Diane is very committed to is to create the correct environment so that President Trump can think that his place of residence is at such a summit rather than in some other issue. Because if he does that from the top down, all the other things that I just showed you will follow.
Great, thanks. So I think this hopefully should give people some idea, because if you think about the shape that the Tennessee Valley was in at the beginning of this, we can't argue that the United States is in much worse shape today, and they were able to mobilize. So I think I'll just open it up for people who have questions, comments, thoughts. Oh, Gary, did you mean to raise your hand? Now you're muted again.
I am? Oh, I thought.
Now, there you are.
Okay.
Yes.
So
for everyone who doesn't know, Gary is my campaign manager, and his brilliant Lena is sitting behind him, keeping an eye on him, as all good wives do with their husbands.
A universal principle.
Yeah, that's right. So anyway, as I expected, Richie obviously did an awesome job of covering that. I have one critique, which is he mentioned all these wonderful aluminum plants on rivers, and I'm less than 2 hours from Messina, so you forgot Alcoa. Thank you very much. You did mention the St. Lawrence Seaway, so that was a step in the right direction.
Yes.
So
yes.
Anyway,
and
I just wanted to put that out there. Yep. Go ahead.
No, sure. Finish. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, just so anyway, this was I think really important for everybody paying attention to the campaign to get a picture of what you had to say there. That this is really what we need to put in to make this all work. So thank you very much.
You're quite welcome. Thanks. I would just say Alcoa, yes, and Reynolds. There are other places, Gary, you're absolutely right. And they built a lot of plants in Tennessee, which if you had asked them in 1933, where are you going to build your plants? And you would say, oh, how about the Tennessee Valley? They may look at you and say, no. But it's true. You look at all the places in New York State, places that have fallen from what they were. But there's no reason they can't, and there's every reason why they can totally turn around. this is it's um, um, it's the idea of a mission. You have to give Americans a sense of what the human mind and physically can do if they can see why it is important to their survival.
Just another small anecdote on the significance of this beyond the immediate moment. I mean, when I was very small, my grandmother, who was nearby where I'm living now, had the opportunity to have me stay with her. A great privilege, I'm sure she thought. Probably a nuisance, but anyway, but when she thought she needed to take my sister and I on a little adventure, I mean, her most favorite place to take us was, the Eisenhower Locks. So it's not, it has a bigger impact than the short-term immediate benefits too. If you bring kids up in a situation where these are the kind of things that they're taken to by the people that they look up to, they come out of it with a whole different view of the world.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Your comments really make me think of Jose Vega and his continuous demand that there be a space CCC in the South Bronx, or plants in the South Bronx. And I see a friend, Jim, who is an iron worker here. I was wondering if you have any thoughts about this, and how you like this idea of 4 million people hired in 9 weeks.
Hi, Diane. Hi. Just want to thank everybody. Great job. It's so informative. Every time that I listen to yourself and your guests, so informative. Yeah, of course, any jobs or anything like that. And we're looking not just jobs, careers. You're looking to make careers, and I think, like the gentleman was saying, you need a vision. A believable vision. To do something like this. And I think any way that we could get people employed like that is great for the country in general. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I would just say, Jim, that think of this much: if we can figure out how to produce nuclear power plants in a factory setting, we can't right now. We produce them one by one. There are certain complexities, and even the smaller ones, like these, what are called small modular reactors, which are 60 megawatts. Those are still produced separately. We have to get them forged in South Korea because we don't have the forging capacity to do that. We should have the forging capacity. And we can recreate that forging capacity. But by a rough estimate that I've done, and we've been discussing it with colleagues, we need to produce 24,000 nuclear power plants in the world, with a ratio of a 1,200 megawatt nuclear power plant for every 4 60 megawatt nuclear power plants. That's a tremendous undertaking. And if we can get the forging capacity, and we can also start to train people in this area, then we're not just talking about getting people back to jobs. We don't want to go back to the previous economy. I mean, in the last 4 years, unfortunately, or 3 years, I stopped looking. I cut it off at February of 2020 because I didn't want to include what happened under COVID, which could be stop cold. But for every one manufacturing job, and we only added 500,000 over 3 years, which is very, very tiny, given the fact that we had lost 7 million in the preceding since 2001. But for every one job that was created there were 3 jobs created in hospitality, which is Disneyland or a hotel or something like that. I'm not knocking it, but it's completely reversed. We have to produce those jobs, and we have to take people, especially in the ages of the late teens and early 20s, and give them a new education so that they are qualified for that. We have to, as you raise the technological level, you have to raise the educational level. And that's what also Jose's getting at with his project in the Bronx. And he's talking to people who are very, they're not even working, and they may or may not have completed high school. But he's saying to them, think of this future. Think of what you can do. Those are the types of jobs we want to create. Then you create a capacity that by 2045, we can be 8-9 times more productive. And you only learn about an economy when you test it to its outer limits. And then you start to see how it opens up. So you're absolutely right. It can be productive jobs. So we would be building Africa, building the nuclear power plants they need, building the hospitals they need, and developing that capability in our own labor force. So we're transforming everyone at the same time.
Can I jump in again with a question?
Gary, yeah, you sound faint, but
Okay. I just wanted to jump in again with more of a question, really. And with what's being presented, I'm a little scared I don't want to lower the level by bringing money into this, but would you maybe be interested in presenting something from a cost standpoint? When you look at this kind of mobilization for the 63 million jobs and the costs involved, and say compare that to the kind of funds that are being put into propping up Wall Street, junk bonds, derivatives, and all that mess right now, just to give people a sense of, if we just stop doing this and put the money where it belongs, maybe what result we would get.
Yeah, people are, excellent point, Barry. People are very strange on the money question. First of all, they think in money rather than in what's the productive capability of your population. How creative are you making them? What is the next leap you want to make? Do we want to go to Mars? Is it just an interesting project that we can say, well, we did it because we also went to the moon? Or are people really interested in what space is like? And where we're going to put where our grandchildren are going to want to be interested in? And as you said earlier, let's say somebody's grandmother, or let's say you take your grandchildren to a place like Cape Canaveral or some exhibit where we already have a colony on Mars by 2028. What will they think about? They won't think of some of the previous limitations we had. They'll use that as their stepping stone and think higher. But let me just say one thing about money. The key thing is you define what your mission is, what you want to mobilize for, what productive capacities you want to unleash. And then you create directed credit, which is what Hamiltonian credit is. It's credit that's put in at low interest rates that can pay back. But so you're absolutely right. Let's say right now we know that the Federal Reserve has since March increased by $3 trillion, what they call quantitative easing, which people on this viewing right now would call just pumping money. That's completely unproductive. Every dollar that you put out that doesn't generate any wealth creates an inflation and eventually hyperinflation. Now let's take the opposite side to think about this. And this is something Mr. LaRouche introduced 50 years ago, at least that's 51 years ago when I first heard it. Let's say you take that same 3 trillion, which built a hyperinflationary bubble because there's nothing underneath it. And the only way you can meet the rates of return on that increased 3 trillion, as Diane indicated, is it has to have a rate of return in the current speculative situation. So it has to come from the physical economy. It has to be taken as a rate of return. And when it can't be taken directly, then you get what's called primitive accumulation. You drive people lower and lower lower living standards so they can transfer the wealth to this bubble. That's one of the principles behind what was going on in Nazi Germany. People say all sorts of things, and they use strong language, and some of it's completely correct, but they don't get the actual economic principle, or one of them, that transfers of wealth. Let's say we put it into something like more advanced processes. You put in quantity X of money, but you get physical product Y, which is greater in value than the X you put in credit. Well, that's anti-inflationary. That's counter-inflationary. For each volume, you're substantiating with an even greater product than you had before. That's one of the features of Hamiltonian credit. And if we took that 3 trillion and use it as a starter for building, for example, the reconversion, opening of those 30,000 plants that have been closed. If we build a high-speed rail network that can go at average 250 to 300 miles per hour, and we drew a map of 42,000 miles connecting the 92 largest cities in the United States, you could leave part of New York and be in Ohio or North Carolina in 3 hours, and you can move goods. You do that, it will be counter-inflationary. And the more credit that you generate in a Hamiltonian LaRouchian manner, the lower the inflation. We will actually have disinflation. And the simplest example when we sent the man to the moon, we had to miniaturize and we had to develop all sorts of powerful systems for the Apollo missions. Today, you have in your cell phone more power than they have in the entire Apollo missions. And you're not paying billions of dollars for it. So you create this massive credit because you have a mission. But for those who scream or complain, but it's inflation, it's inflation. What about the money? What about the money? The money is credit. It's a decision by mankind to do something. It's an intention. It comes from the word credo, or the Italian credere, to believe in something. And you believe that mankind in the future can do things that he can't do today. And you issue the money towards that. And you will not only get tremendous amounts of wealth, but you will lower the inflation at the same time. So there's myths on this stuff, which it's very clear that they're just wrong.
Heard? Yeah, I just wanted to very concretely, you brought up some of this, but I have the Lillianthal book here, and I have to show you this beautiful, can you see? There's his autograph. Anyway, but just he describes a bit of what you went through, and it is quite amazing. And I think it gives people a sense of how, when you invest in production, you actually get a multiplier effect in return. It's infinitely, it's a completely different direction than bailing out Wall Street. So he talks about electricity. 10 years ago, the per capita electricity production for the TVA was about 60% of the per capita average. Rich already said that. Today, the figure is half again as great as the United States average. Here, that is Tennessee Valley, in the past decade, the amount of electricity produced per person increased 500%, twice as fast as in the United States as a whole. 10 years ago, the estimated annual power production per person in the Tennessee Valley, as nearly as can be computed, was only 400 kilowatt hours. In 1943, this had increased almost 6 times to 2,400 kilowatt hours, to be compared with the annual production per person of 1,530 kilowatt hours. That's one measure. Then he describes what happened with the farms in all different states. In 5 years, one community in Virginia reports food production doubled. The director of the Extension Service wrote of the demonstration farmers. quote, they have twice the number of beef and dairy cattle now as in 1937. They have 24% more sheep, 13% more chickens, and 31% more brood sows. From Kentucky, the number of livestock has more than doubled since the beginning of the demonstration 4 years ago. More hay and improved pastures are being produced at the present time. The acreage of corn has been reduced 1/3, but increased fertility has given the same yield as at less cost and less labor. In Georgia, they say cotton yields increased from 275 to almost 400 pounds per acre. So what you see in practice is a complete refutation of the lies of the environmentalists who say that the more you progress, the more you're going to deplete all your resources and run out of things, whereas what Lyndon LaRouche insisted was true and was a foundation of American system economics, but he developed it more fully, is that actually when you invest in this kind of way and that kind of development, you can produce more with less, that you become phenomenally more productive, just as Rich was just demonstrating with the cell phone, which has in it more computing capability than entire gigantic rooms at NASA did during the space program. And this is just such an incredibly optimistic outlook for mankind. And you think about these poor children like Greta Thunberg, or these poor kids in the Black Lives Matter, or, you know, what young people don't appreciate today is the value of their mind to completely transform nature. So are there any other questions or comments? I hear an echo somewhere. Yes?
Hello?
You're faint, but maybe Dave can turn up your volume.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. It's very informative. I really appreciate listening to all this tonight. You know, one thing I did want to mention or interject, perhaps, you know, the prospect of further production or increased production throughout the world. You know, I think what we need to really concentrate on is, you know, the means of production in terms of the possibilities of adhering to the green energy constituents that are, you know, very, very much alive and that are out there in today's society. And I'm sure, you know, not to say that I agree with a lot of what they're saying, but I'm sure there's many different avenues that we can pursue in terms of production that could be very adherent to that, you know, that protocol. Any comments on that?
I do, but maybe Diane wants to say something first.
When you say that protocol, you mean green?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you know, you mentioned production, how we could increase production worldwide, you know, but what means of production, you know, and how would it be done? And can it be done in such a way that it would have a positive environmental impact on, you know, on the world, you know? We could sort of get away from the petrochemical conglomerates that have been out there for so long.
Well, I'll say a few things, and I'm sure Rich has some thoughts, but one of the amazing things in Lillianthal's book actually was he said that there's two principles for these kind of great projects. One is
Fusion.
Harmony with nature, and
Right.
two is morality, the improvement of humankind. And I was a little bit surprised because we've all been so brainwashed by the environmentalist movement that whenever you hear anyone talking about nature, you say, does that mean they're anti-human? Does that mean they want to just kill? And what happened to the Tennessee Valley was a perfect example of this. This was a place where the topsoil was all getting washed away. the nutrition of the soil was completely depleted. People had no control over it. And once the river was harnessed and regulated by man, by human hand, the creative human beings in the image of the creator, the entire valley flourished, and you had actually all kinds of new species of animals and fish and things that were able to thrive there that had not before. So I think that what is actually natural is for human beings to develop the planet with ever increasing more dense forms of energy. The problem with things like solar panels, what?
Oh, go ahead. Excuse me. I'm sorry.
Well, solar panels and windmills are very diffuse. They take, in the case of solar panels, more energy to produce than they're ever going to yield. And windmills, they're completely unreliable in countries like Germany, which foolishly shut down its nuclear plants after Fukushima, actually has to build so much backup capacity because if the wind isn't blowing the right speed, or it's not sunny enough, or the solar panels blow off the roof or whatever, you have to have backup so that their energy costs 4 or 5 times more than energy here in the United States, for example.
Well, I believe the gentleman before mentioned, in terms of production, somebody mentioned the figure about 24,000 nuclear power plants built throughout the world. There has to be a better means of production than nuclear power plants, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I just think they're entirely too dangerous, and I'm sure there's other means and technologies that we could harness that would be safer for us and for the environment.
Okay, let me address that. I do want to say one thing, and just keep this in mind. The critical question of economics is, how do you produce through each generation of production a human species which is more creative and has a greater creative power? That's the aim. We are going to increase production, and we're going to do all those things that we talked about. And I'll address the nuclear question. But what you're really looking at is to enlarge the capacity of mankind to explore, to discover, to produce geniuses on Earth. That's the aim of economics. If someone cites to you there's an economic law different than that, then they're generally not talking the truth. Now, to take the question you're raising from a slightly higher standpoint, but to address it, I'm sorry, I didn't get your first name when you first got on.
Wayne.
What's your name?
Wayne.
Lynn? Okay.
Wayne.
Okay, Lynn. Okay.
Wayne.
No.
Wayne.
Wayne. Sorry, Wayne. Okay. Here's the thing, Wayne. Let's look at it this way. There are different views of mankind. One says, well, nature at a certain level reached its maximum. You can't go past it. It was somehow perfect, or it was at least the best. And then if you go beyond that, you're violating nature. Now, the reason that's said, and that's what the environmental movement
We've been violating nature since before the industrial age, then, I guess, if that's the outlook by some people. Go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, you're absolutely right. That would be the outlook.
Yeah.
But where should we have stopped? When the Earth had no oxygen at all? Was that the perfect method? Or when we had dinosaurs on the Earth? I mean, who's to say where the perfect level is? But we can get a sense of where the perfect level is by the process of man perfecting. There's not a perfect. And I find it ridiculous to say, well, not ridiculous, but I find it just wrong to say, well, the perfect was obviously in the 18th century, the 17th century. I think that's not the case, but that's the limit that you're imposed with a closed system of environmentalism. But there are two features about it, one of which is worse. The people who developed the environmentalist movement were the Nazi movement. They had eugenics. And there weren't just people, don't just think of people in Germany. Much of the German Nazism came from Britain, from the governor of the Bank of England at that time, Montague Norman, from the royal family itself, from various people who had this race science. And it was in the United States as well. And after the war, if you said, I'm a eugenicist, which meant there are people who are superior and there are people who are inferior, and we have to get rid of the inferior people, that wasn't going to work, Wayne. We had just gone through a bloody 6-year war in which we defeated that conception. So what was set up with organizations like the Nature Conservancy, groups that seemed like innocuous groups like the Society for Fauna and Flora, which were run by very high levels of the British oligarchy. And they said, well, instead of we support the idea that there are inferior races and we should eliminate them. But they didn't say that. They said that just won't work. So what we'll say is that anything that leads to certain types of progress is necessarily polluting and detrimental to the earth. That will work. And that's the genesis. And I could give you loads of organizations, Julian Huxley, people like that, Bertrand Russell. Diane could give you the precise quote, but he said in 1953 in Science and Society that we're just growing too many people. And a Black Death once in every generation would deal with that. It might seem, I forget the word, ugly but so what of it? So this was a euthanasia genocide movement. They also, to bring down progress, and anything that was developing was obviously anti-environmental, and they went crazy to try and prove it. Like Rachel Carson put this complete fraud that certain insecticides and pesticides were killing birds. People who then went out to the same areas that she was in, measured just the eggshell, how thick it was. It was thicker. It was more sturdy. It was just completely made up. Now, on that basis, everything that leads to advance, which is what mankind's future is, was labeled carcinogenic and destructive and so forth. Let's take the case of nuclear power, which Eisenhower supported tremendously in Atoms for Peace. He wanted to bring it around the world. There's a huge difference between a nuclear bomb and the power, the way that uranium 235, 238, and plutonium are even machined, because what goes into a power plant has about an 80% concentration. In a bomb, it's 3 to 5 to 9, 12% depending on what you're doing to supply power. They have developed what are called Generation 3 and Generation 3 Plus systems, which will completely shut down. And some of the stories you heard, like about Fukushima, the problem wasn't the plant. The problem was the tsunami. It just overwhelmed the plant. It would have destroyed anything in its path. It destroyed lots of people. And therefore, the system that was meant to make it safe didn't function. Even though the media screamed, just like they're screaming now that Trump is this and he's horrible and that and he's doing that, and then you ask for the evidence. They've sent people back to Fukushima. That's the Japan one that people may be familiar with, where all the horror stories came. And the level of deaths is very, very low. So the point was, this was a fraud. Nuclear power is very advanced, and the way you can measure it, Wayne, and I would just think about this way. Think of a garden hose, and I'm going to point the hose sideways. And if I could measure the amount of water that comes out per second, and I could take a cut of that hose, that's called energy flux. It's not with water, but it's with energy. In other words, how much energy per unit of area comes out in a moment. Nuclear power has the advantage that its energy flux density is it's more than 100,000 times greater than coal or gas, and it's more than 1 million to 10 million times greater than windmills and biomass and so forth. And what man does is he increases the energy flux density. And this drives the enemies of mankind who want to reduce the world's population, who do not want growth, who do not want people progressing. Crazy. And if we develop fusion, that's 2 more orders of magnitude, add 2 more zeros to your thing. And that's the progression. And as man has gone through this, from burning wood to oil and coal, to fission, nuclear fission as we're talking about, to fusion, that is the pathway of development. And you can measure it. And it deals with what Diane cited from Mr. Lillianthal. You're putting less input and getting greater output by the increase of energy flux density. And if you take the energy flux density and the increase of the cognitive powers of man and the increase of the powers of machine tools, then we will be able to reach Mars. If you took the premises of environmentalism, we could never get a rocket ship off the Earth. You're not going to launch it with a windmill. And it's a fraud. It's just a fraud, and you just have to examine it and examine why people push that forward.
We have another, well, Gary has another question. Wayne, thanks. I always love when you have questions. It's actually good.
One thing I wanted to say is I'm not advocating any environmental, green energy strategies. It's just that, it's nice to hear, the way you sort of pontificate on these other various, forms of energy, meaning nuclear fission and fusion, things that, we should discuss, that should be discussed. But, there's always that safety factor that really needs to be kept in mind. That's the only thing that really concerns me, and I'm sure most of us. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. I think Richard answered. Gary has something. Gary, why don't you go ahead?
I just had a really brief consideration on the nuclear power question, which was something I'd come across, and unfortunately I don't have the documentation right at my fingertips to point you at, but it can be found. But basically, if you look at it from a per kilowatt hour production, I mean, a lot of what people are talking about when they say that nuclear energy is dangerous has to do with the waste product. If you look at it per kilowatt hour of energy produced, things like solar power actually have more toxic waste per unit of energy produced than something like nuclear. And not only that, because it's considered environmentally friendly, it doesn't have any of the kind of regulations on the treatment and storage of that waste. And of course, that leaves completely aside the whole issue of the fusion torch and the fact that most of what we're calling waste is really fuel and resources.
Sure.
But I just wanted to put that out there for another whole sort of angle on that and how you need to think about it.
Yes, I agree with you, Gary. It's well put. And the thing is also, what people call waste from a nuclear plant, they're very safe, is what I'm getting at. Aside from, we've also written about 3 Mile Island. I won't go through it here, but we can go through the story. And Chernobyl was a plant that had been an ancient plant, was being way overworked, and so forth, which we can talk about. But the waste from a nuclear power plant, we have something called enrichment. And waste, if you enrich it, is fuel again. It's actually a cycle that can keep growing further and further. So the danger of the nuclear power plant is to make people hysterical about, and we've written things. I mean, there are stories. If you want levels of radiation, they're higher on the ski slope in Colorado than they are around the nuclear power plant. But the critical thing is, it's to make people hysterical at growth. Say, okay, well, we'll let you grow, but you can't have a nuclear power plant. Oh, and you can't have coal power plants. And by the way, some of these other processes are far too dangerous, or they're cancers. And these are hoaxes for an agenda which would reduce the population down to 1 billion. And when I say that, there are people who said it, that they want to reduce the Prince Philip, but there are many, many others. The guy who wrote The Population Bomb, Paul Ehrlich, said that we should reduce the world population down to 2 billion. Now, if you take them at their word, and I do believe that that's what they are thinking, we have 7.8 billion. How are you going to go from 7.8 billion to 2 billion? You're going to use concentration camps. And that's the green agenda. Unfortunately, that is the truth of the green agenda. There are good reasons to want to be safe. There are good reasons to have harmony with nature. There are good reasons to enjoy a beautiful mountain view or beautiful flowers. But the green agenda is to wipe out population. And it uses a hook to get people drawn in, which is not true, and eliminates the concept of increasing potential relative population density and energy flux density.
Good. I think perhaps we can wrap up for this evening. Or is there something else?
Yes.
Jane?
Jane, yes. Hi.
Go ahead.
Okay. I was born and bred in New York, or I never left the state hardly at all. And it was Roosevelt that really got some of his New Deal programs going in New York State. I think Gary knows about that, and surely you all know about it. And I just wondered, and I have to say the presentation tonight was very exciting. I have, in all of my studies, I've rarely seen pictures of the TVA. There's always the illusion the TVA was wonderful. It got people out of poverty. But to have these graphics tonight, to have more detailed stories and figures that reflect the change, how the economy was improved and culture and so on. So I would be interested if, since you're running for senator, Diane, I would be interested if there might be a presentation about what FDR did in the way of introducing the New Deal to the degree he did in New York State before he was elected president. That's a question I have for perhaps a future program.
No, I think that's a great idea. I mean, maybe Richie wants to say more, but in terms of the campaign, we've actually discussed, since New York State is the state of Alexander Hamilton and Franklin Roosevelt, and they're so closely related. And you may have seen, Jane, or I'm not sure if you've seen, we're doing a whole series on statues and monuments in the state. But the question of what FDR did and what Hamilton did is going to be a real theme. And
Okay,
Rich may
great.
have more on New York State per se. Go ahead if you do.
Yes, this has to be taken to the summit. It has to be taken to the summit of Putin, who has spoken well of FDR. I don't know the full scope of what he knows. Xi Jinping said he studied 3 American presidents. One was FDR, one was, I believe, Washington, the other was Lincoln. 3 excellent choices. And we have to have President Trump educated on this, and others, because it's not just going to be one person, but to walk in and put the agenda on what FDR did as the American legacy. Americans care about the rest of the world. The idea that we don't, it's false. By developing them, which means we develop ourselves, which means we also get to know how to develop all of mankind. That situation, which Helga LaRouche has been talking about, and it's absolutely correct, and I agree with your saying, and I know Diane believes that should be a thrust of her campaign. But some of the people that this Harry Hopkins, who did the Civil Works Administration, he worked for Roosevelt when he was governor from 1928 to 32. So you're right, there's an incubation basis here. But the point that you're making, and Gary made earlier, I think, is this is needed now. We have a financial breakdown, we have a COVID crisis, we have a crisis of potential war, very real, nuclear war. And this is the approach that has to break people free, which once they take it, they can start to see the world in an open way, the way that Helga has said, the coincidence of opposites, where the conflicts are not the key thing, but the common solution is.
Thank you so much.
So I think now we'll conclude. Dave tells me he can show the front page, I guess, of the Schiller Institute website, which I want people to see because you can see the picture of Bill Binney there. On Thursday at 11 a.m., Bill Binney will be giving an international press conference on what he is able to prove with a certainty, well, at a margin of fallibility of 1 times 1 and 1 times 2 to the 35,000 zeros or something like that. Whatever it was he said, I think it's a precise statistic from computer calculations, the zeros and the ones. So at any rate, this will be very, very important, and everybody should get on the Schiller Institute website, schillerinstitute.org, and register yourself for the press conference. Share the link with everybody you can. Put it out on social media. We really want to get this out far and wide so people can join us Thursday. And then otherwise, one thing that's being discussed nationally is that people actually write personal snail mail, that is handwritten letters, to President Trump, urging him to accept his offer for this P5 summit, and I would say urging him to exonerate LaRouche. We've gotten reports from people who have sent a number of handwritten letters that they've gotten letters back that are not form letters. So someone there is reading these things, and I think it's important, but we should do everything that we can. So I hope everyone can join us on Thursday at 11 a.m. Thank you, Richard Freeman, for being here. And thank you, Gary, campaign manager. And on my, I don't know if it's the same on everyone else's screen, but on my screen, Chris Sayre, my husband, who's also my treasurer, is under Gary. So for everyone who hasn't met Chris, there he is.
Hello. The information for the meeting on Thursday was put in the chat box, so people can copy and paste it real quickly if they want.
All right,
It's
so I'll
also on the
stay.
website.
We can stay here for 5 seconds more, so they have the opportunity to get it out of the chat box.
So you
Great.
said Chris was your treasure, right?
Oh my, this meeting has gone on too long.
All right, good. Hopefully everyone's got it. Chris has been embarrassed, and thanks, Richie.
It's okay.
And we'll see everybody on Thursday.
She was actually saying Chris is her treasure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Good night, everybody.